Hello, consider yourself very welcome. Today I am reviewing The Situation and Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Oliver Twist was first published in 1837 in the periodical Bentley's Miscellany, which Dickens was editor of at the time. Typical. If you want to get anything published, it's not a question of what you know, it's who you know. The plot follows little orphan Ollie, who is born in mysterious circumstances in a workhouse, and with no clue to his identity, is raised there. If you don't know anything about this story, or anything about workhouses, I'll just say they were happy-go-lucky institutions where people were well looked after by the compassionate folk that run them. So pleasant were they, that even the utterly destitute would often refuse to go to them, preferring to take the chance of dying in the street. Deprived of adequate food, glorious food, Oliver risks life and limb and asks for more. He is forcibly removed from the workhouse and bought by a funeral home. Business is brisk for child burials, and Oliver is deemed a fitting mourner, obviously to be exploited for financial gain. After a scuffle with another poor boy at the funeral home, he runs away to London. Here he meets all of the characters that most people will be familiar with, including the likes of Nancy, the Artful Dodger, Fagin and Bill Sikes. After he is falsely accused of robbing Mr. Brownlow without even picking a pocket or two, he goes to live with that gentleman while he recovers from being struck ill at his trial. It will come to light later that Oliver is related to Mr. Brownlow. Upon his recovery, he is kidnapped by Nancy while running an errand and returns to Fagin and Company. Bill Sikes needs a young lad for a robbery, so they take Oliver, knowing that his involvement will make him less likely to testify against them. The robbery, though, goes awry and Oliver is shot attempting to escape. The family they were robbing take the boy in and nurse him back to health. This family includes Miss Maylie and Rose, who is portrayed as something close to angelic. She will, in the denouement, be revealed as Oliver's auntie. It's a fine life and a small world full of coincidences, apparently. Oliver is kidnapped again, but Nancy goes to the Maylies and tells them where he is. Noah Claypole, the poor boy who fought with Oliver in the funeral parlour, has come to London seeking his own fortune. He too falls in with Fagin, who, suspicious of Nancy's changed behaviour, asks him to follow the girl. All is revealed, prompting Sikes to kill her. Hiding out in London, Sikes is cornered and, in his escape attempt, manages to slip and hang himself. Fagin is arrested. His associate Monks turns out to be Oliver's half-brother, who has attempted throughout the book to keep Oliver from discovering his true identity in order to pocket his inheritance. Fagin will go to the gallows. The Artful Dodger also fails to dodge the long arm of the law and ends up transported to Australia. It's a pretty grisly end for most of Fagin's crowd, with only Charlie Bates reformed and avoiding any of the unpleasantness. But it's a happy ending for young Oliver, as he is returned to his true and rich family. What might take readers by surprise, especially if this is their first exposure to Dickens, is how cartoonish this is. Mr. Bumble, as you'd expect, is something of a buffoon, embarrassing himself and later his wife at every turn. His every appearance is scoffed at by the narrator. Sikes is the sort of vicious bully that kicks his dog when he's in a bad mood, and is rarely seen in any other kind of mood. Nancy is the fallen domestic angel, a touch of her innate goodness bubbling to the surface every time she's not saying, "I'd do anything for Bill." It's even true of some of the pretty minor roles, such as the magistrate Mr. Fang mistaking the plaintiff, Mr. Brownlow, for the crook, and Mr. Brownlow's friend Grimwig with his regular insistence that he'll eat his head if proved wrong on any of his many proclamations, a catchphrase Dickens enjoys mocking almost before it even becomes one. The important thing to note about all of this, however, is how glorious it all is. I've read a lot of good books this year, a lot of bad ones too, but as soon as you start, and long before you get to the boy for sale part, okay, that one was a bit contrived. It's very clear that this is a cut above absolutely all of them. All of Dickens is cartoonish, characters work perfectly on the page, Sikes is a sneering, hateable villain, the gruesome Fagin oddly sympathetic as he tries to curb the worst of his associate. But Mr. Bumble is the absolute highlight though, a strutting peacock brought down to earth by some of the most biting prose you'll ever read. Along with the gentlemen who run the workhouse, Bumble and his future wife, Mrs. Corney, feel the full weight of Dickens's savage satire. Their cruel nature is laid bare when Mr. Bumble is recounting the story of a pauper who, denied help by the workhouse, says, "I'll die in the streets." Bumble finishes his story with, "Well, he went away and he did die in the streets. That's an obstinate pauper for you." Dickens's social commentary is very harsh. He pulls no punches, slamming the conditions and the hypocrisy of the workhouse. This extract is from after Oliver has asked for more food. "Let it not be supposed by the enemies of the system that during the period of his solitary incarceration Oliver was denied the benefit of exercise, the pleasure of society, or the advantages of religious consolation. It was nice cold weather, and he was allowed to perform his ablutions every morning under the pump, in a stone yard, in the presence of Mr. Bumble, who prevented his catching a cold, and caused a tingling sensation to pervade his flame by repeated applications of the cane. As for society, he was carried every other day into the hall where the boys dined, and there socially flogged as a public warning and example. And so far from being denied religious consolation, he was kicked into the same apartment every evening at prayer time, and there permitted to listen to and console his mind with a general supplication of the boys, containing a special clause therein inserted by authority of the board, in which they were entreated to be made good, virtuous, contented, and obedient, and to be guarded from the sins and vices of Oliver Twist." Dickens starts the following passage with, "It chanced one morning, while Oliver's affairs were in this auspicious and comfortable state." That's quite scathing, but Dickens viciously rounds on his critics on page 25 with, "I wish some well-fed philosopher, whose meat and drink turn to gall within him, whose blood is ice, whose heart is iron, could have seen Oliver Twist clutching at the dainty viands that the dog had neglected. I wish he could have witnessed the horrible avidity with which Oliver tore the bits asunder with all the ferocity of famine. There is only one thing I should like better, and that is to see the philosopher making the same sort of meal himself, with the same sort of relish." Against the comical cartoonery and the savage social commentary, there is also some very real-seeming looks at the world of the time. Check out chapter 52 for the depiction of Fagin's last few days as he awaits execution. It's genuinely harrowing, extraordinary not just for its effect, but its position in the text. Fagin's grim, affecting end is chapter 52. 51 and 53 detail Oliver's happy ending, so it's a striking contrast as well as a wonderful piece of writing. The differences between the giving, compassionate Oliver and his half-brother Monks is a major theme. Monks is a vicious coward and a crook, squandering his world of opportunity as Oliver struggles honourably along with nothing. The impact of mothers, particularly bad ones, on the lives of their progeny is explored in a fair amount of Dickens. See also Mrs. Nickleby and Mrs. Gradgrind in Hard Times, to name just two. The inescapable conclusion here is that if Monks and Oliver are from the same stock, and turn out as they do, then no mother at all is better than a bad one. Oliver is an unusual protagonist, lacking any sort of power or agency over his own actions, and despite lacking any kind of a female role model, he's quite effeminate. Dickens's female characters are prone to fainting in the face of any kind of difficulty really, and Oliver has the same affliction here more than once. Likewise, his long illness mirrors Rose's in that there seems little in the way of any physical cause. Oliver is emotionally driven, spending most of Rose's illness crying, for example, and like the domestic angel model espoused at the time, has a highly developed desire to be subservient and please those around him. It's also interesting that the first clue to Oliver's identity comes when Mr. Brownlow notices a resemblance to a portrait of his mother. Neither of Oliver's parents have any significant part in his upbringing, so Dickens had free rein here to choose either, so it's interesting that he chose to identify Oliver with the feminine. Additionally, the final act of the book sees the Fagin and Brownlow camps effectively battle it out for his custody, and while it's pretty clear which side he'd choose, he is largely absent from proceedings. It's a little bit of a shame in that the book is at its impeccable best when he's around, and when Dickens is lashing out at those exploiting their positions of privilege. It's no surprise that alternative media have focused on those sections and trimmed down the others, because Dickens's gentry, Mr. Brownlow, Miss Maylie, Rose and Harry, are the book's least interesting characters. interest in the Maylie household is propped up by the schemer Mr. Losberne and the dopey dog's bodies Giles and Brittles, the latter described as having been born into the family and treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. The Brownlow house would be singularly perfect and equally dull without the odd interjections and cynicism of Grimwig. The reveal of his heart of gold towards the end is a really nice touch, deftly handled, but that rather goes without saying. The book may be 160 years old, but it isn't just its familiarity through movies and plays, etc., that make this accessible. Dickens is a great writer, both of people. The self-important Mr. Bumble, despite his exaggerated depiction, can only be based on a real person or an amalgamation of many. But also Dickens's pithy turn of phrase makes for some highly enjoyable descriptions of people that come so easily as to almost be seen as laconic, such as this description of the magistrate Mr. Fang from pages 63 and 64. If he were really not in the habit of drinking rather more than was exactly good for him, he might have brought an action against his countenance for libel and have recovered heavy damages. The best example of this realist caricature portrayal of people comes from when Brittles and Giles chase off the robbers. Their behaviour is comical, yet under the circumstances also seems completely fitting. Combined with Dickens's wicked eye for a fool, the whole section, including Mr. Losborne's scheme to throw off the unwanted police investigation, is nothing like as famous as the scenes set in the workhouse or among Fagin's family of crooks, but is every bit as good as this short extract from page 173 demonstrates. Now, Brittles and Giles are pursuing the robbers when their better instincts kick in and they cut their chase short. Returning home, they discuss the reasons why their blood isn't quite so hot as it was at first. "I know what it was," said Mr. Giles. "It was the gate." "You may depend on it," said Giles, "that the gate stopped the flow of excitement. I felt all of mine suddenly going away as I was climbing over it." By a remarkable coincidence, the other two had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment. It was obvious, therefore, that it was the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all three remembered that they had come into sight of the robbers at the very instant of its occurrence. And his setting of the scene is sometimes really quite beautiful as well, as in this example from page 141. The night was bitter cold. The snow lay on the ground frozen into a thick, hard crust, so that only the heaps that had drifted into the byways and corners were affected by the sharp wind that howled abroad, which, as if expending increased fury on such prey as it found, caught it savagely up in clouds, and whirling it into 1,000 misty eddies, scattered it into the air. Sharp winds, savage clouds, this is a depiction of a cold that hurts, a cold that's malicious and predatory. It's very vivid and very powerful. In conclusion, this is one of the most famous pieces of English culture, for a good reason. It's wonderful. By a country mile, the best book I've read this year, an absolute joy for its jet black satire, a beautiful mix of characters both real and cartoonish, prose that perhaps isn't as elegant and intricate as his later work, but is still both remarkable and highly enjoyable. Who will buy a book like that? Hopefully everyone. When people like, comment and subscribe, it makes me happy. I don't even mind when people comment just to tell me how much they disagree with me, so use all of those options as your heart sees fit. I won't say goodbye, but thanks for watching, and cheerio, and be back soon.